All right, guys, so Michael Parenti, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome. Chapter 7. You all did love him once. You all did love him once, not without cause. That's in Shakespeare's play. You all did love him once, not without cause. Julius Caesar, Act 3, Scene 2. Gaius Julius Caesar was a man of outstanding qualities, a commanding figure, uncommonly intelligent, attractive, and utterly charming when he cared to be. His associate Sallust testifies that he was esteemed for the many kind services he rendered and for his lavish generosity. An inspiring military leader, he was famously liked by his troops, whom he led with a mixture of eloquent exhortation, bold example, iron discipline, and the rewards of plunder. Unlike most members of his class, he disdained luxury and excessive self-indulgence, though he was something of a dandy in his dress. Also, unlike many members of his class, he usually refrained from excessive alcohol consumption. Even his enemies admitted that he was a temperate imbiber. As one of them remarked, Caesar was the only sober man who ever tried to wreck the Constitution. Caesar had no need to convince himself that he possessed exceptional qualities, but he strove to make it difficult for others to deny or devalue his abilities. His military exploits demonstrated his mastery over men and situations and promoted his own dignitas, reputation, authority, distinction, adding to his popular support and his ability to effect much-needed reforms. Highly regarded for the elegance and charity of his writing. Highly regarded for the elegance and clarity of his writing, Caesar was thought to be one of Rome's greatest prose stylists. His intellectual interests were impressively polymathic. He was a patron of arts and learning and had an expert interest in astronomy. Considered a superlative public speaker, he could stir crowds and touch hearts with his words. Even a renowned orator and bitter political rival like Cicero was obliged to admit that he knew of no one more eloquent, witty, lucid, and endowed with a more varied yet precise oratorical vocabulary than Gaius Caesar. Caesar also possessed some less than perfect traits, to say the least. He was known for his extravagant expenditures of borrowed money through much of his early career. Great sums passed through his hands, enabling him to buy elections, gather political influence, and raise armies. Suetonius observes that he was not particularly honest in his auriferous pursuits, pillaging shrines and temples and sacking towns, pillaging, especially ones with rich inhabitants. He stole 3,000 pounds of gold from the capital itself, replacing it with gilded bronze, and he extorted nearly 1.5 million gold pieces from King Ptolemy of Egypt. Far worse than that, like other military commanders of his day, excluding many of the Optimates, he was a despoiler of distant lands. It has been argued that his conquest of Gaul was a blessing in disguise. Deeply divided among themselves, the Gauls could not have withstood the impending onslaught of the Germanic tribes. In their subjugation to Rome, they found peace and stability. Indeed, Gallic units did join Caesar's legions to fight against Ariovistus and other German invaders, but the blessing of Roman conquest offered no deliverance for the tens of thousands who were killed, bereaved, uprooted, enslaved, or otherwise made destitute during years of sanguinary contest. Like sanguinary contest. Caesar himself owns to the worst atrocity his troops committed. In the siege of Avaricum, when they slaughtered almost 40,000 inhabitants, sparing neither those infirm with age, nor women, nor children. And how do we apologize for his treatment of Vercingetorix, a Gallic leader whose major crime was to wage a valiant campaign against Roman military domination in 52, in a last-ditch attempt to preserve the independence of his people. When finally defeated, Vercingetorix was imprisoned by Caesar. He spent 6 years in chains only to be taken from his cell, marched through the streets during a triumphal procession honoring Caesar, and publicly executed. As in every empire, the common people of the imperial nation itself also paid a price. From the dark soil of Spain to the hot sands of Egypt, the bones of Roman soldiers littered the empire. And of those who survived, what would be sufficient payment for their lost youth? Lucan had Caesar's weary legionaries complaining to him, what limit of warfare do you seek? What will satisfy you if Rome is not enough? We have lost the enjoyment of life. We have spent all our days in fighting. Caesar's sins also included those he shared with his era and his class. He was a slaveholder like all other leading Romans, and like many of them, he used slaves and women for his personal pleasure. Like other Roman leaders, he treated women as negotiable marital objects. He gave his daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey as a step toward cementing their early political alliance, even though Julia was betrothed to Scipio. To appease Scipio's wrath, Pompey promised him his own daughter, although she in turn was already engaged to the late Sulla's son. When Julia died in childbirth in 54 BC, leaving Pompey a widower, Caesar sought to reverse the growing estrangement between them by offering Pompey his great niece Octavia, unmindful that she already had a husband whom she would have to abandon. Caesar further asked leave to marry Pompey's daughter, who was betrothed to Faustus Sulla. That Pompey declined both these proposals was likewise due to considerations more political than personal. Caesar was notorious for his sexual exploits involving, among others, the wives of numerous aristocrats and several queens, including Cleopatra. The poet Catullus, who despised Caesar's politics, inveighed against his escapades in the boudoir, and shall that wretch with haughty gait, exulting in his lofty state, around our marriage couches move. Caesar and his friend Mamurra, who was his chief of engineers in Gaul, were peers in adultery and greed, rival mates among the Nymphids, the shameless sods. Upon returning from a victorious campaign, Roman commanders were usually awarded a triumphus, or triumph. This consisted of an elaborate procession followed by feasts, entertainment, and the awarding of honorary privileges to the commander. Immediately after a triumph, it was customary for soldiers to gather before their general and subject him to scurrile jests. Such thrusts were intended to take him down a peg, thereby averting the jealousy of the gods. As Martial writes, after a triumph, no shame is it to a commander to the subject of wit. So during the celebrations of 46 BC, Caesar's troops assembled before him and sang a ribald verse suggesting that he beheaded women from across the social spectrum. Home we bring our bald whoremonger. Roman locks your wives away. All the bags of gold you lent him when his Gallic tarts to pay. These and a number of other jibes Caesar endured in good spirit. In his younger days, Caesar served briefly as King Nicomedes' catamite. At his triumph, his troops sang a ribald verse about that too. And when in part Caesar conquered the Gauls and Nicomedes conquered Caesar, he received this particular recitation with something less than good humor. And when he tried to deny it, he incurred the additional penalty of laughter. Caesar's early dalliance in Nicomedes' court and several other homosexual encounters later in life left him open to taunts from political enemies, including Cicero and Dolabella. Wishing to advertise Caesar's reputation for both adultery and sodomy, one opponent described him as every woman's man and every man's woman. Contrary to the impression we might have, the Romans of the late Republic were an odd mixture of profligacy and prudery. Many seem to have indulged in same-sex liaisons. Caesar, Catiline, Mark Antony, Gabinius, Sallust, and Augustus are only a few of the better known. Still, homosexuality was not considered an acceptable practice. A century before Caesar, Polybius reported that any soldier in the Roman army who in full manhood committed homosexual offenses risked being flogged to death. The Ley Scantinia, a law of uncertain date, penalized homosexual acts committed with persons of free birth. To sodomize a fellow citizen was to rob him of his Roman manhood. Same-sex exploitation of the slaves, however, carried no penalty. Since a male slave was not thought to possess a manhood, he could not be deprived of it. A common form of political invective was to charge an opponent with effeminacy. Playing the passive role in a homosexual liaison with either anal or oral submission was considered the worst of perversions. Cicero fixed upon this mode of attack in his vendetta against Catiline in 63. He spoke of Catiline's praetorian guard of pansies and charged that Catiline regularly seduced young men in the most repulsive fashion, and he disgustingly allowed others to make love to himself. Cicero even saw homosexuality as a training ground for crime, exclaiming before the Senate, "Catiline's insidious seductions that trapped one young man after another have left them well equipped for a career of dreadful crime, or thoroughly stimulated to pursue a life of unrestrained sensuality. These soft and pretty boys are experts at making love and having love made to them, and they know how to dance and sing, but they have also learned to wave daggers about and sprinkle poisons." The animus between the optimates and their prime adversary, Julius Caesar, could breathe a crude homophobia into their deliberations. As Suetonius tells it, a victorious Caesar once twitted a packed Senate house by announcing that he would triumphantly mount the heads of his opponents, an expression that carried a double meaning, the latter implying fellatio, like getting oral sex. When someone called out that such a feat would not be easy for a woman, Caesar attempted to parry the affront by observing that Semiramis had reigned as queen in Syria, and the Amazons once held sway over much of Asia. Virulent homophobia retained a currency well into the imperial era, even while some emperors undisguisedly indulged in same-sex relations. Writing early in the 2nd century AD, no less a man of letters than Juvenal fulminates against the decadence of many upper-class males, the effeminate perfumed lads who painted their eyebrows, donned earrings and see-through dresses, flounced about with hand on hip and married other men. These fluttering queens, he grouses, acted like no real queen, such as Semiramis, bearing the quiver, or Cleopatra on the deck of her Actian warship. In Juvenal's mind, their effeminacy stood in pathetic contrast to the upright Roman warriors of an earlier epoch, the purveyors of an untainted virtus, virtue, whose feats of manly courage and sacrifice gave Rome its supposed grandeur. Damn. So Caesar. Well, even the optimates were doing that, or like even the aristocrats, the nobles who had money, they would use their slaves for sex. But Caesar was doing it too, and he was supposed to be, although he was smart, brilliant, he was still going against the law, being hypocrisy, as well as him being for the people, and he was plundering. He spent a lot of money. He wasn't a drunkard, but he was irresponsible. He didn't like to look good, So Fuller's summation is doubtless the shared opinion among the many historians who reside in Cicero's camps. Caesar was a supreme opportunist, possessed of a magnetic personality and boundless egotism. He lacked both fear and scruple, a man who would allow nothing to stand in his way. In fact, Caesar's purpose seems to have been not to destroy Republican liberty, but to mobilize sufficient popular power to break the stranglehold of the senatorial aristocracy, reducing it to an adversary and an administrative body. He himself claimed his intent to be the people's champion rather than their master. To be sure, facile democratic professions have dripped from the lips of many an artful autocrat. Still, his words ought to be given some consideration, for they were often backed by actions. In 49, after crossing the Rubicon, he proclaimed, "I merely want to protect myself against the slanders of my enemies, to restore the rightful position, the tribunes of the people who have expelled because of their involvement in my cause, and to reclaim for myself and for the Roman people independence from the domination of a small clique." Arriving in Rome some weeks later, he summoned together those senators who had not departed with Pompey and said, "I was insulted and outraged by the interference with the rights of the tribunes. My aim is to outdo others in justice and equity, as I have previously striven to outdo them in achievement." Some of the Democrats sought a far-reaching social revolution with the cancellation of all debts and a division of wealth among poor Roman citizens, excluding slaves and foreigners. Caesar found their support useful, but he took care not to tread too hard upon moneylenders and big landowners. Still, as we shall see in the next chapter, his policies were redistributive, enough to cause consternation among the upper class. He went far beyond his predecessors in providing for the masses, writes Yavitz, and this was precisely what antagonized the senatorial aristocracy. It was not Caesar's personal ambition that incurred the of the optimates. In their world, ambition was of a common currency and perfectly acceptable. They loathed his egalitarian sympathies, his long-standing concern for the interests of the people. To be sure, the conflict between nobiles and proletari was not so neatly placed. The nobles and the workers, the proletariats. There were some senators not part of the optimate inner circle who supported Caesar, and there were plebes, freedmen, and foreigners who, because of clientele enlistments and payoffs, ran with their aristocratic patrons. Still, if not perfectly, then roughly, class lines were drawn in the fight between Caesar and the Senate oligarchs. To this day, defenders of class privilege resort to ad hominem attacks, maligning any leader who pursues policies on behalf of the common people as a self-promoting demagogue, a panderer intent upon usurping power, like turning over power. To be sure, no popular leader can afford to be indifferent to considerations of popular power. Mass support is needed as a countervailing leverage to challenge entrenched ruling class interests. In other words, the pursuit of power and the pursuit of egalitarian reform are not mutually exclusive, but mutually imperative. While leaders doubtless derive personal gratification from their acquired renown, it would be a mistake to think they are motivated only by the pursuit of popularity and power, especially those who align themselves with the powerless and the downtrodden. As we have seen in the late Republic, siding with the masses was a perilous undertaking, not a promising career choice for ambitious leaders. Few popularity enjoyed being snubbed and branded as seditious agitators by their peers. None enjoyed being threatened with bodily harm. None anticipated that by courting the support of unorganized masses, they would win a smooth ride to the pinnacle of power. Those like the Gracchi, Claudius, Caesar, and others who ventured forth as champions of egalitarian causes paid the supreme price for doing so and were propelled by something more than, or in addition to, self-aggrandizement. And what of the demagoguery of the optimists? Seldom do scholars of the late Republic raise any question about self-interested duplicity and aggrandizement in regard to those privileged and powerful elites who advanced their interests by any means necessary. To many historians seem to share Cicero's glowingly lyrical depiction of his elitist colleagues as men who ruled for everyone's benefit, presiding over the helm of state with all their skill and devotion. Hypocrisy. Little was said about the misleading demagogic appeals made by Cicero and his cohorts, pretending to be protectors of the people while in fact operating as their ex-proprietors. The optimists come down to us through the filter of gentlemen's history as men of the highest principles. Actually, they stuck only to those principles that fit their notion of the good life as they experienced it. They opposed land reform, rent control, and debt cancellation. More for the many meant less for the few. They opposed the secret ballot and all forms of popular input, yet they were demagogic enough when running for public office to represent themselves as friends of the people. A leading protagonist of the Optimate faction was Marcus Porcius. Cato, the younger, hailed throughout the ages as an unblemished keeper of republican rectitude. Plutarch lauds him for being devoted to the rigid justice that would not bend to clemency or favor. Dio says that Cato was the only one of his generation who partook of politics from pure motives without any individual desire of gain. Valerius refers to his brave and unblemished life, his virtue complete on all counts. Valerius says that Cato, in every particular of his conduct, seemed more like the gods than mankind, and Sallust describes Cato as propelled only by righteous honesty. Modern historians are almost as effusive, extolling Cato as a formidable, high-principled conservative, the redoubtable leader of the oligarchy and of high birth and character. Even Theodore Mommsen, who once slipped and called Cato a dogmatic fool, cannot on other occasions find enough good words for him, honorable and steadfast, earnest in purpose and in action, full of attachment to his country and its hereditary constitution. Little attention has been accorded Cato's imperfection. Thus, while he pronounced mightily against corruption and swore to prosecute bribery, he indulged in it himself, contributing to a slush fund on behalf of the conservative Bibulus, his son-in-law, when he stood for the consulship in 60, and what amounted to a spree of vote buying that elicited indignant comment even in that jaded era. Spree of vote buying, so he bought votes that elicited indignant comment even in that jaded era. The optimists were intent upon stopping Caesar, who was also spreading largacity among the voters. But when Cato indulged in vote buying, it was no longer a matter of corruption, but of high moral necessity. For bribery under such circumstances was for the good of the commonwealth. In 51, Cicero was appointed governor of Cilicia, southeastern Turkey. He performed his duties competently and honestly, pocketing only the money that was regularly allotted to him, rather than plundering the province for all it was worth, as was frequently the practice. He also successfully engaged in military actions against brigands in the province. Upon his return in 50, he was awarded for his service with a public thanksgiving by the Senate. Cato voted against the thanksgiving. When asked by Cicero why he had done so, Cato explained not too clearly that, in effect, Cicero's provincial administration had been worthy of praise, but not of a public thanksgiving, unless the thanksgiving be credited to the gods rather than to him. Immediately afterward, however, Cato voted for a thanksgiving for his son-in-law, Bibulus, whose accomplishments were certainly no more notable than Cicero's. It seems the rigorously upright Cato could bend his standards for favored family members. Parenti is kind of reaching there. But it makes sense, that's what he did. Cato once urged that every candidate for tribune be required to deposit a huge sum of money in order to stand for office, a move that would have undermined the democratic mandate of tribunate by turning it into a rich man's preserve. In 52 BC, he and Bibulus recommended that the Senate appoint Pompey to rule as sole consul in default of elections and in violation of all constitutional practice. Again in 49, even as other members of the hierarchy remained uneasy about the move, Cato urged the Senate to put the entire state command in Pompey's hands in order to suppress the people's movement mobilizing around Caesar. A few years later, with the clouds of civil war gathering, one senator suggested that freedom should be granted to slaves in order that they might be used for military duty, a proposal that won support among the senators. But fixed in his property-loving principles, Cato argued that it was neither lawful nor right to deprive masters of their possessions. On at least 2 occasions, he defended political murder as described in chapter 5 with the vehemence of speech. Plutarch's words, Cato swayed the Senate to uphold, on the basis of dubious testimony, the unlawful execution without trial of Lentulus and other political prisoners implicated in the Catiline conspiracy of 63. 11 years later, when the Optimist gang leader Milo murdered the people's tribune Claudius, Cato again cast aside legal principles, urging that the murderer not only be freed but rewarded for services rendered to the state. Cato appeared in court for Milo and most probably voted for his acquittal. In a word, when popular leaders pursued policy on behalf of the people, Cato treated the obstacle-ridden procedures of the unwritten constitution as chiseled in stone. But when the optimists needed to bend or even suspend rules and basic rights, as their class interests might dictate, Cato was capable of infinite flexibility, treating the Constitution as not only elastic, but expendable. The law could be suspended to save the law, even if it meant setting free a murderer like Milo. The law could be suspended to save the law. As Cato saw it, Milo was not a murderer at all, but a defender of the Republic. For Cato, anything done to safeguard the fixed concerns of his entitled coterie was ipso facto constitutional. For the interests of the aristocracy were seen by him as confluent with the well-being of the entire polity, like the entire polity, population, or maybe the entire party, political party. According to one, it's polity, the P-O-L-I-T-Y. According to one of his modern-day admirers, Cato never confused the personal and the political realms and remained without animus towards the person of Julius Caesar. In fact, he hated Caesar, seeing him as representing everything he loathed: self-aggrandizement, contempt for the Republic, a betrayal of his class. As we have seen during a senatorial debate in 63, Cato delivered a snarling Cato delivered a snarling personal attack upon Caesar, addressing him without warrant as "you drunkard." So Cato called him Caesar a drunkard in a senatorial debate in 63. Although he voiced disapproval of alcoholic overindulgence in others, Cato himself was known to tarry frequently in his cups until deeply inebriated. Dio claims that Cato was a lover of the people as no other, but his love did not extend to seeing them decently situated. Ergo, he led the attack against Caesar's land reform. Yet even the uncompromisingly conservative Cato could compromise when popular forces marshaled enough strength to force an issue. Thus in 63, as proletarian restiveness seemed to be assuming menacing proportions, he became duly alarmed and persuaded the Senate to placate the urban multitude by including them in the grain distribution. Plutarch calls this an act of humanity and kindness, though it appears more an act of grudging expediency designed to successfully dissipate the threatening danger, as Plutarch himself writes. Cato was said to have been of impeccable character in his personal affairs, but even here one might raise an eyebrow. Aristocratic women were traded like so many game pieces, and marriages extended to advance family fortunes or political alliances. Cato was no exception to the practice. First, he gave up his own wife, Marcia, to his very rich elderly friend, Hortensius, to marry. Hortensius was seeking a community of children with Cato. So he said, and Marcia was still young enough to bear offspring. Also, he wanted his kids to be like the same blood. Indeed, she was said to be pregnant with Cato's child when she was passed off to Hortensius. Some years later, when Hortensius died, leaving Marcia an immensely wealthy widow, Cato rekindled his interest and remarried her. All this was enough for Caesar to accuse him of trafficking in marriage. For why should Cato give up his wife if he wanted her? Or why, if he did not want her, should he take her back again? Unless it was true that the woman was first set as bait for Hortensius and lent by Cato when she was young, that he might take her back when she was rich. Ooh, interesting. Cato was devoted to the public, but the public that counted was Cato's own class, the hereditary nobility. Lily Ross Taylor reminds us. Cato's cure for the ills of his day was apparently much like Cicero's in the Republic and the Laws, a return to pre-Gracchian days. Today, the Cato Institute, a conservative think tank, is named after the illustrious reactionary because he resisted Caesar's rule and supposedly championed liberty. The Cato Institute? Needless to say, the narrow class nature of that liberty remains unacknowledged by Cato's admirers. So too is Marcus Brutus hailed as acting only from upright motives. Brutus could not hide his distaste for Caesar's reforms, showing little sympathy for destitute petitioners and much concern for the brimming purses of the rich, especially his own. He was a leading conspirator in the assassination of a great popular leader who had pardoned him and treated him well. Marcus Brutus. Shakespeare dubs Brutus the noblest Roman of them all, and has him saying, "I can raise no money by vile means. By heaven, I'd rather coin my heart." So I can raise no money by vile means, like by being corrupt or stealing or ravaging. Only by heaven, I had rather coin my heart. Like I'd rather be rich, I'd rather be poor than earn money the wrong way. So I can raise no money by vile means. By heaven, I had rather coin my heart and drop my blood for drachmas than to wring from the hands of peasants their vile trash. The reality is something else. Brutus was a usurer of the worst sort and a spoliator to boot, like a spoiler, and a usurer, like someone who takes. Having lent money at 48% interest instead of the usual 12%, which was usurious enough, the noble Brutus then demanded that the Roman military help his agents collect the debt from the hapless Cypriot town of Salamis in the 50 BC. At Brutus's insistence, the town council was besieged until 5 of the elders starved to death. Even Cicero was horrified by the terms of a loan that brought ruination to the Cypriot community. He was also put off by Brutus's arrogant and uncivil tone when dealing with the matter. Brutus once wrote to the people of Pergamum that if they gave money to Dolabella willingly, They must confess that they had wronged Brutus, but if they gave unwillingly, they can prove it by giving willingly to Brutus. On another occasion, he wrote threateningly, I can't say it, he wrote threateningly to the Samians because their contributions were non-existent. Still, most classical historians have not an unkind word for Brutus, preferring to treat this money-grubbing assassin as a principled and unblemished defender of the Republic. So most classical historians, even Shakespeare, maybe they just didn't have enough history. So there remains a double standard. Leaders who take up the popular standard are faulted as the power-hungry authors of their own unhappy fates, while their assassins are depicted as the disinterested stalwarts of Republican virtue. He's saying there's like a misinformation. Some people have the idea backwards. As best we can tell, the Roman people themselves did not see it that way. So there remains a double standard. Leaders who take up the popular standard are faulted as the power-hungry authors of their own unhappy fates, while their assassins are depicted as the disinterested stalwarts of the Republican virtue. So I think the first one's saying the leaders who take up the popular standard are faulted as the power-hungry authors. Yeah, I understand what he's saying. As best we can tell, the Roman people themselves did not see it that way. Anyway, it's the end of chapter 7. I know it was a rough chapter because of my voice, but I hope you made it through. Peace.